Greetings. I see the room is filling up very quickly tonight. Get comfortable. Have a beverage or a snack in hand. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds. Make sure you have your chat open so that you can say hello. We'd love some greetings. Who are you? Where are you from? How are you feeling this evening? How about that for a prompt? While folks are getting comfortable, I just want to remind you that we are recording this webinar. If you want to turn on your closed captioning, click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with many thanks to our colleagues at Community Foundations of Canada, this session will be in English with simultaneous French interpretation. To access the interpretation, please click on the globe at the bottom of your screen and choose the language of your choice. Don't forget to also click on the mute original audio for clearer sound. We'll give 30 seconds for folks to get a little bit more settled and we'll get started. I see folks saying hello in both languages in the chat. Please do so yourself. We have a full agenda tonight, and so I think I will dive right in. I'm Sharon Avery. I'm the CEO of Toronto Foundation, and I'm just been so looking forward to this evening, as have many people from across Canada. We actually, though we are the Toronto Foundation, we are hosting folks from coast to coast tonight for a very important discussion around the state of philanthropy. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. Tonight's event is about understanding the issues and opportunities facing philanthropy and about the ideas and shifts that are taking place in our sector. It's about reimagining philanthropy in order to drive greater impact today and in the future. In reflecting on tonight's conversation, the voices and thoughts that really jump-started our approach at Toronto Foundation over 5 years ago were Indigenous voices. The first organization to talk about reform and change was the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada. The Circle's message was and is of thinking, learning, and doing things differently, and the need to do it together. Increasingly, we think about how important it is that we are in this place. And for those of you, you're in many places tonight, working alongside and learning from our Indigenous colleagues as we advance our work in the sector. And through this time, there have been incidents that have made our work even more urgent. We have also seen positive change, including the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, an Indigenous-led and serving fund with support of Community Foundations of Canada, Toronto Foundation, and many others. Some of you are in the audience today, so thank you. As guests on these lands, I am grateful to have the opportunity to work, live, and connect and learn with so many and with all of you tonight. Before we dive in, I'm going to do a quick poll just to get a sense of who's joined us for some collective learning. You should see the poll on your screen now. Which one best describes you? Are you a foundation fund holder? Are you someone who works in the philanthropic sector or the nonprofit charitable sector, or are you just a community member, not just, most especially a community member interested in the topic? Please respond and we'll just take a look. It's always good for our guests, Andrew and Senator Omadvar, to know who's here. And I just love seeing all the hellos as well, the greetings in the chat. Keep it up, it's fantastic. I think our results are coming. Wow, it's a nice mix tonight. I'm so delighted. Welcome to all of you to this space and to this discussion. For our part, learning and change have been a constant for us at Toronto Foundation, and we've been exploring how to make change through our research and our granting and our class of 2022 donor learning program by applying an equity lens to everything we do, which brings me to tonight's session. This inaugural State of Philanthropy event is the newest addition to our annual learning lineup and an opportunity to delve into the issues in order to better understand the sphere in which we work. To help us learn more, we're so delighted to have brought together two of Canada's leading philanthropic voices and reformers, some might say disruptors, Senator Ratna Omidvar and Andrew Chunilil, for a fireside chat on the role of philanthropy in our society and why reform is needed to drive greater impact. The Senator and Andrew will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll follow it with a Q&A. So folks, get ready with your questions because you're going to have the opportunity to ask them. A few final reminders before I introduce our speakers. We are together tonight until around 8:15, depending on how lively the conversation gets. As I mentioned off the top, we are recording the session. You might have noticed that we use the chat to post comments and important links, so make sure you have the chat open. And as I said, there'll be a chance to ask questions, so use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We will be monitoring this and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So finally, let me introduce our guests. In 2016, the Honourable Ratna Omidvar was appointed as an independent senator representing Ontario. Senator Omidvar has over 30 years of experience working in the charitable sector at senior levels of management, as well as serving as a board director and volunteer with over 35 organizations. Andrew Chunilil is CEO of Community Foundations of Canada, where he works closely with colleagues from the Community Foundation family across the country and abroad to inspire the philanthropic sector to look in the mirror, show courage and ambition, and listen to our communities more than ever before. And that's what we're here to do tonight. And so I'm going to hand things over to Andrew to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for having both the Senator and myself, and for the Toronto Foundation for hosting this important conversation. Senator Omidvar, the last time I had the privilege of being in conversation with you in a very public way was at a Community Foundations of Canada conference back in 2017 to celebrate our sesquicentennial. And you were on the stage with Nitan Obad, Desmond Cole, and myself. And we had a really interesting conversation. And that conversation alone was quite provocative and changed the trajectory of philanthropy in this country. And I'm so delighted to revisit some of those topics here in 2022. So welcome. You and I have known each other for a long time. So I'm just going to jump right in to some of these questions. And these questions have been provided to us by the Toronto Foundation. And I was taking a read through, and these are some challenging questions for us to tangle with. But I have the privilege of asking you the first question. So here it goes. Senator Omidvar, I'd like to start by asking you a provocative question. Do we still need philanthropy? Does it continue to serve its social compact, or must we reimagine it so that it truly serves a whole of society and not just a few, not just the few through which those privileges are perpetuated?
Thank you, Andrew. And I want to thank the Toronto Community Foundation, Sharon and her entire team for inviting me to speak to you and to this amazing audience. So even as the COVID crisis has restricted our physical interactions with each other, it has also expanded the reach. So I think there's pros and cons, although frankly, I would love to stand with an audience and speak directly to them. To your question, I'm going to come down very squarely on the side of yes to philanthropy. I cannot imagine a world without philanthropy. But at the same time, it cannot be business as usual. We've come out in the last 2 or 3 years. We've sort of almost come through fire with the COVID crisis, which has highlighted inequities, with the discovery of the grays in the Indigenous residential schools, with the disclosure of the deep-rooted and sustained impact of racism on Black communities. So I think philanthropy cannot go back to simply business as usual. It needs to refocus, it needs to reimagine itself, it needs to renew itself, it needs to cast its lot on the side of change and not on the side of status quo. It needs to be a force for justice. And it also needs to change its personality, I think. It needs to come from a place of humility. It needs to be prepared to be somewhat uncomfortable. And I've said this for a long time, it needs to not be flirtatious. So that's, if we do all that, and I cast my lot in with the philanthropic sector, then we will have relevance. I also don't believe, Andrew, that everything that philanthropy has done has been wrong. Absolutely not. It has been a powerful force for change. And let me just cite a few shining examples, and I will continue to do that today, even as I highlight what needs to change and what is in fact not so good. So the McConnell Foundation's focus on mainstreaming social finance, the historic work of the Atkinson Foundation on workers' rights, or even one of my favorites, the Smart Saver Foundation in releasing available tax subsidies to the poor. And I'm sure there are many other examples, but here's the problem. These are not in the mainstream of philanthropy. Foundation assets have grown spectacularly over the crisis. They stand at $100 billion. But in the main, philanthropy and foundations has not signaled a shift to not just owning the money, but also owning the problems. And there are significant issues with, a small cohort of people exercising so much power. I reflect, Andrew, I mean, I'm now in politics, so I reflect on all of this. I reflect on those who spend tax dollars and how they are held to account through elections. We vote governments in and out. We vote parliamentarians in and out. But we cannot do that with philanthropy, even though philanthropy derives its benefits from tax-exempt public dollars. In my view, these are public dollars in private hands. So there must be a higher level of accountability as well. So that's my view on how philanthropy should behave and change. But let me ask you, Andrew, the same question, but in a different way. What do you think philanthropy will look like in 100 years?
Wow, 100 years is a long time. It's difficult for me to speculate that far out, Senator Omidvar, but I appreciate that your question is about the future. Over the holidays, I had a chance to revisit Darren Walker's, and he's the president of the Ford Foundation, New Gospel on Wealth. And it was inspired by Andrew Carnegie's Gospel on Wealth, written in 1889, over 130 years ago. Andrew Carnegie, in a way, was the originator of the mode of philanthropy that is prevalent today. And Carnegie proposed that the best way of dealing with the new phenomena of his time, which interestingly enough was wealth inequality, was for the plutocracy to utilize surplus wealth in a responsible and thoughtful manner. Carnegie emphasized generosity, but he also asserted that the wealth should be centered in what they want to, and what wealthy people want to fund and how they want to fund it. Now, Darren Walker built on this notion and extended it further in the New Gospel, and he connected generosity to justice.
Justice, yeah.
And in philanthropy, this is what he says. He says, in philanthropy, there's a spectrum of giving that exists. Generosity is focused on helping someone in need. Justice is about solving the problems that created the need in the first place. And so a healthy society needs both. And at Community Foundations of Canada, we feel that it's time to dedicate more resources to the fight for justice. So specifically to your question, Senator Omidvar, I see a philanthropic sector in the future that is more focused on justice, but also holding generosity as two critical features of our work. So the logical question for philanthropy is, what does it mean to be oriented towards justice? And let me provide an insight from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. I'm just going to read it. Justice-oriented giving is an act of righting a wrong, leveling the playing field, and removing the illusion of recipients as less fortunate. It fully acknowledges past circumstances that have driven inequalities and prompts givers to recognize the advantages that some groups and individuals have gained over the years of economic and racial injustice. This is the work that we should be committed to doing across this country. It's not uniform, and all parties have their own starting points, but it remains our challenge. Although we need to keep in mind, we don't have 100 years to get to justice. It needs to start now. So I think this is a good transition, Senator Omidvar, to our next question. We're at a moment in time when philanthropy is in the firing line. There is growing public distrust of extreme wealth and an erosion of faith in foundations for their lack of transparency, diversity, and some have even questioned its public good. What do you believe are the drivers for that public sentiment, and what can we do to counter it?
Thank you for sharing Darren Walker's philosophies with us. I'm also a student of Darren Walker and really appreciated your underlining of the bend to justice as the future for philanthropy. But to your specific question, we're like, what's driving this? I think the drivers of public sentiment around the growing mistrust of philanthropy are both perceptions and reality. And the perception is, and you've talked about it, that philanthropy is the purview of a privileged few, that it exists in a bubble of privilege, and it's out of touch with the reality. And then there's the evidence, and the evidence is pretty stark. Less than 1% of charitable dollars flow to Indigenous causes. Less than 1% of charitable dollars flow to Black people. How does this happen? You have to ask. Is it just the governance? Are philanthropists really out of touch with what's happening on the ground? The Philanthropist, which I read quite regularly, recently observed that there is a trend in foundations and charitable organizations to snowcap their organization. That's a new terminology for me, but I like the metaphor it creates. It means that the field work can be carried out and possibly is carried out by members of impacted communities, but the governance and decision-making is largely exclusive of lived reality. There's also a perception, and I don't think it's completely wrong, that the garnering of extreme wealth comes at some point through exploitation, be it of people, of the environment, of the tax law, or others. So there is suspicion, and it does not help when philanthropy blows its own horn, and it almost always casts the light on the donor. I think it is important that we get beyond perceptions and get to evidence. So, I'm going to put out a challenge to community foundations and other foundations here that we need to actually gather the evidence. It would be terrific if we could get some polling done on trust of the philanthropic sector. Where does it lie today? How the trend line is moving, and what we can do about it. Another feature in this growing mistrust is, frankly, the excellent work investigative journalists have done. I'll just point to the example of the Sackler family in the United States, the disclosure of their marketing practices on fentanyl, and at the same time, their very generous donations to mainstream cultural institutions in the US. So all of this plays in. So, I want to get back to inequity, and I don't want anyone to have the impression that I believe that philanthropy is at the heart of inequity. Absolutely not. Inequity is created by societal structures and government policies and all kinds of things, and government indifference and callousness. But if the philanthropists are truly the better angels of our nature, then where have they been all this time? What can we do about it? That's a bit more of a complex question, and I'll start off the conversation. Again, all the answers do not lie with philanthropy. But when they do, then the first mantra, I believe, should be humility. There is a famous saying, nothing for us without us. Apply that as a first principle. Don't do to people, do with people. And if you develop that bent for justice that Andrew talked about, and you put yourself in the circle as a student and not as the oracle with all the answers, then possibly you will get on the right path. So this brings me to a question to you. Again, I want to know what you think. The Community Foundations of Canada is a major mainstream institution in the philanthropic sector in Canada. You're standing at the firing line, I'm sure, with the same questions, if not from your fund holders, but from your communities as well. And they're probably asking you, there is all this wealth. Why is it not addressing the needs of the community? How do you respond to that kind of public scrutiny and attention?
Well, thanks for the question, Senator Omadvar. First off, I have to say I have great faith in community and private philanthropy, and I believe that both can play an important role in building resilient communities. Philanthropy is rooted in humanity and goodness. The challenge isn't philanthropy per se, it's whether our institutions can keep pace. You mentioned extreme wealth. Economic inequality has been exacerbated through the last 2 years, and people in Canada are living with this every day. Both the wealthy and the non-wealthy see and feel it. Consequently, we are more aware of the divide than ever before. And you're right, philanthropy is in the firing line because severe concentration of wealth has impacted our own balance sheets. And in fact, this is our paradox. It's not our intention, of course, that when inequality accelerates and surplus wealth is created, our assets and our endowments grow. But this paradox, it creates responsibility. To your point, Senator, to use capital to counter inequality. And there are great examples of foundations already doing this, but we need more. I don't believe that community foundations or private philanthropy need to be apologetic for this relationship, but it would serve us well to acknowledge it and look at how our organizational models, informed by local lenses, can use our philanthropic wealth to resolve the growing divide. Senator Omadvar, you mentioned scrutiny, and I certainly don't want to sidestep that question. It's a difficult question to answer, but I have to walk a careful balance. My role as CEO of Community Foundations of Canada involves representing the voices and plurality of perspectives from within my community foundation network or our community foundation network. I also have my own points of view that may be divergent from that same constituency. Now, I can do both. It's not binary, and there's no false dichotomy here. My role does not preclude me from having my own position and opinion on the issues of today. In fact, it warrants it. In community and private philanthropy, leadership diversity is severely lacking. And by that, I mean at the most senior level. With that in mind, it should be fully expected and anticipated that my voice at times might be contrarian to many leaders in the sector. It's not easy for me to have these conversations, but I'm determined to keep having them. That's because I think philanthropy can be an agent for change. And it's important for me that we don't undersell our ability to make a difference, but live up to our responsibility to do so. I also have to acknowledge I have great privilege all around me. I am surrounded by some exceptional leadership from community foundations and private foundations across the country. Leaders who are strengthening belonging, advocating for justice and equity, and taking action on anti-racism, truth and reconciliation, and transforming their own business models. There are many agents of change in philanthropy, including right here at the Toronto Foundation, who also face scrutiny. It takes courage to host an event like this, and I admire that type of leadership. So allyship is how I deal with scrutiny, and I appreciate when it's provided. Now back to you, Senator. We'll put you on the hot seat again.
Okay.
As a public servant, you know well the power of government to enact change, but there is inherent, quote unquote, small c conservatism and risk aversion in how governments operate. The argument philanthropy has often made is that it can take greater risks, make calculated bets on social programs without the consequences of failure. Do you think that argument still holds true? Are foundations still playing a role in our society?
Thanks, Andrew. That was an interesting reflection on your role leading change at a community foundation, and I admire your ability to represent the voice of the foundation, but also your own voice. I think that's a significant observation that I will keep in mind. I don't have to do that anymore because now I'm a senator. I represent just my own point of view. So getting back to your question, I understand that argument well, or that foundations are the risk capital of society. I used to make it all the time when I led a private foundation. It takes risks that governments can't take. It's the loss leader, so to say. It invests in solutions that can be scaled up by government when they work. In this narrative, the philanthropist is cast as the hero, as the venture capitalist. However, there is a basic problem with this argument, because unlike the venture capitalist, who may reap the benefits of his or her risk-taking, philanthropists who use tax-protected public dollars, I'll keep hammering home, it's tax-protected public dollars, really do not bear the risk, because after all, it's really not their money. The risk is really is taken by the communities who are in the petri dish of innovation. And this insulation from real risk, I think, should spur greater risk-taking. And I'm not sure it has. The examples you and I know of, again, possibly represent a fraction of foundation's wealth. Again, I think we need some evidence, and this evidence should be generated by the philanthropic world itself. But again, you know, I think I don't see risk-taking and R&D as the main course on a philanthropist's dinner table, not yet. Because the greater the risk, the greater the chances of failure. I know that. And so untested solutions lie fallow and the status quo persists. But again, I will root for inspired philanthropy and inspired risk-taking by giving you an example. And I'll throw out an example that is funded entirely by philanthropists from the business world. It's called the Century Initiative. It imagines a bigger, bolder Canada at the turn of the next century. None of the people around the table will be around to see if Canada is really big and bold. Now that's risk-taking, and that I admire. So here's a question to you and those who know me. And I've noticed a lot of names in the attendance. There are quite a few people that I still know in the sector, but those who know me, and you, Andrew, will appreciate this question. And it is all about the lack of representation for greater diversity from Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities in not just the philanthropic field, but in its leadership. As someone who has broken through, and you're a reformer operating within a system that is deeply entrenched, what's been your experience of trying to affect change from inside?
Yeah, good question, Senator. You know, I think in this case, diversity is synonymous with community relevancy. You know, we've been talking about diversity for a long time. I mentioned the conference in 2017 where you and I chatted. I think there's progress being made in this area. I just want to draw two examples. The Prince George Community Foundation, who is now chaired by its first Indigenous female leader, who used their Vital Signs program to showcase how gender pay gap disproportionately impacts Indigenous women, and then provided a response to that. Another leading edge advancement in this area is the Calgary Foundation. They engaged in an equity audit with the support of an external consultant. And not only that, they posted the results of their audit on their webpage to their community and are allowing the community to hold them account for what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. So these are remarkable, remarkable accomplishments and things that we can be real proud of. They're acts of building trust and fostering more depthful connections with the communities in which we operate. Senator Omenvar, you mentioned an interesting word there. You mentioned entrenchment. You are right. Change has been difficult. And as I mentioned, it's happening. I began my career in philanthropy in 2007. At that time, we did not talk about reconciliation, racism, climate change, or inequality at the board table or in any leadership circle. It was a no-go area and deemed to be impolite conversation. And if one attempted to put it on the agenda, there was quick deflection and rationalization of its exclusion. You know, as you know, I co-lead CFC with my colleague, Andrea Dix. And I remember her and I were traveling the country in 2019, and we visited community foundations and community foundation leaders. And oftentimes it was told to us that the word inequality was not something that was used, or that inequality didn't exist in particular areas. And so sometimes it's not just difficult for me. My colleague, Andrea, who has been working in the area of gender equality for years, also faces similar pushback. But here we are, it's 2022, and the dialogue around inequality is becoming much more robust. Who's not talking about inequality? So the change is happening, and we're certainly optimistic at Community Foundations of Canada. Two other examples come to mind. The Rural Community Foundation of Nova Scotia is embedding gender equality across their work, not only in their granting, but their investment practices. The Quebec organization, Innu EU Community Foundation, is an Indigenous-led community foundation that is focused on protecting and preserving the boreal forest, protecting native species, honoring cultural connections. There are many other examples. So I feel really optimistic about where we're going, but we still have a lot of work to do. I'm gonna turn this back on you, Senator Omenvar. Many people outside of philanthropy will be unaware of the debate within our sector of the disbursement quota. I know, here it is, the disbursement quota finally showed up. The minimum amount that a charity must spend on charitable activities, that is what the disbursement quota is. And despite being an obscure tax rule governing charities, at the heart of the debate is whether foundations should be required to give more than what is currently stipulated. Now, here's the question. Why do you believe this has surfaced as such a hot button issue, and what does it mean for our sector?
So a quick answer to that is to quote Winston Churchill: events, my dear, events. The event being the COVID crisis, which has, disclosed and deconstructed inequality in ways that we did not imagine. And on the one hand, many Canadians lost their jobs, had to expose themselves to severe danger, lost their lives looking after other people. And on the other hand, the investments of wealthy people grew and grew. And let's just take a look at philanthropic assets grew from 86 billion to close to 100 billion during the last 2 or 3 years. So naturally, this wide chasm between the two sides of the those who have and those who have not has been exposed. And frankly, the government has also been clever enough to understand that the disbursement quota is low-hanging fruit for them. With a regulation, they can change the disbursement quota and have billions of dollars flow out into the community and do and get put to use without it costing the treasury a single dollar. So you have to think of the government also as grabbing on to an idea. Now, I personally do not believe that this is a bad idea. I think it is time to talk about the disbursement quota because it's only 3.5%, having dropped from 5% to 4% and then to 3.5%. And all these changes were made by the Ministry of Finance in response to the crash in 2008. Foundations needed to, regarner and refurbish their assets so they could do work, and that made sense. But since then, I mean, the recovery has been phenomenal, but the disbursement quota has stayed where it has. So what will this mean for the philanthropic sector if this amendment or regulation goes through? And I'm an independent senator. I really don't know what the government is going to do, although I do have a very strong suspicion that the disbursement quota will be raised. I don't know to what extent it will be raised. They may stagger it a bit, small foundations this much, medium, treat foundations a little differently based on size and scale. But foundations should be ready to being required to open their purse strings a little. My argument, though, with loosening the disbursement quota without attendant changes in the income tax law and in governance and leadership, what will we see? We will see the bulk of the money going to the institutions that are routinely favored by the wealthy. I think we all know what we're talking about: big hospitals, big museums, big universities. Not that they're not important institutions to give to, but in this discussion that you and I are having, we're talking about inequity, and that's not where the money is going to flow. So, whilst I was studying the philanthropic sector during the first ever Senate study on charities, I delved very deep into the issue of foundation assets, donor advice funds, endowment funds. And so along with this question about disbursement quota, there's also a larger conversation about the permanence of endowed foundations. Many foundations, I used to sit on the board of a few where permanence was baked into the bylaws. And some people have argued that the problems of today are best solved by the wealth created in our time, and others argue that the problems of tomorrow can only be solved if foundation assets grow so that they can be used to address intractable problems of tomorrow. There's pros and cons on all sides. What are your thoughts on this subject?
Boy, these are really sensitive conversations, Senator. Conversation about disbursement quota and permanent endowments is perhaps the most polarizing issue we have faced as a sector in a long time. And it goes beyond analytics and organizational models. It is emotionally charged. When we talk about it, and when we talk about permanent endowments, we are talking about the sacred cow of philanthropy. It is traditionally where we derive our power, our privilege, and our positionality. The disbursement quota submission process, the federal government is in receipt of over 200 or close to 200 submissions. Now, I've not read them all. I probably have looked at around 8 to 10 submissions, and I can tell you, Senator, the spectrum varies on how we move forward. There is a plurality of perspectives, and no one uniform position can be derived. In fact, even within the Community Foundation Network, we have vastly different perspectives on the path forward. But let me just take a little step back from disbursement quotas, and I want to offer a quote that many are familiar with. It's from Martin Luther King Jr., and here's the quote: "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary in the first place." End of quote. I offer that quote because that is our conundrum. After far too long, many foundations are now willing to talk about racism, reconciliation, social justice, and inequality. However, we still struggle to talk about permanent capital and endowments as it relates to those very issues. Why? likely fear of eroding that power, privilege, and the positionality that we have. That's a derivation of the capital. Before I go on, let me acknowledge one thing. I'm the CEO of Community Foundations of Canada. My livelihood and economic well-being is largely dependent on those endowments. CFC would cease to exist in its current form if it were not for permanent capital. However, my self-interest and related bias cannot be the basis for me to avoid looking inward and challenge how we steward and deploy capital. In particular, at a moment when so many people are asking us to. So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes I have to offer my own personal point of view, and that point of view may be incongruent with others. Well, I'm going to offer a personal point of view, and I offer it with great humility and respect for all of us who are working in philanthropy, because we're having a difficult conversation. So here it is. We cannot fully address the areas of reconciliation, racism, inequality, or climate justice as exclusive or separate to discussions on permanent capital. To do so will leave us falling short of the goal line. We must hold the duality of these relationships because they are, in fact, intrinsically linked. Now, Deloitte, one of the world's leading professional services firms, published a document last year. It's called What's Next for Philanthropy in the 2020s. In fact, Sharon Avery was one of the informers to the report. And this report it's a North American report. It's informed by philanthropic leaders all across the continent. I'm going to read you a quote. It says, philanthropy is often, and here's the key word, insulated from shifts outside the field by virtue of, quote unquote, permanent endowments. This is not my point of view. This is the point of view of a report that's been compiled by leaders across the philanthropic network. So more and more people across philanthropy, including our network, are recognizing the need to change how we think about capital and community needs. How can we really endeavor to tackle racial discrimination if we don't also acknowledge that permanent endowments insulated us from building relationships and moving resources to both the Black and Indigenous communities? And that's detailed in what you said, Senator Omidvar. You didn't say the name of the reports, but I will. The unfunded report and the Canadian Charity Law Group report. How can we build trusting relationships with our Indigenous partners without acknowledging that some of our permanent capital, where some of our permanent capital has come from and at whose expense? How can we answer humanity's code red to slow down global warming without also acknowledging that our investments have not historically taken the environment into account? How can we alleviate the most significant wealth disparity of our time without acknowledging our beneficial relationship to that very same wealth disparity? Now, some may suggest that this is an anti-endowment position. Quite the contrary. It is very much a pro-endowment, pro-permanent capital position. Because if we respond to those needs and hold conversations around those two things that are intrinsically linked, we can unequivocally hold permanent capital, and we can hold it forever. Now, this requires us to engage in transformative thinking, which is vastly different than optimizing what we currently do. And this is where the reform comes in, Senator Omidvar. But I think this conversation is a good segue to something that's really close to you. You recently passed a bill in the Senate, the Effective and Accountable Charities Act, that would make it easier for funders like the Toronto Foundation to support the activities of nonprofits that aren't registered charities. Now, here's the question. Can you tell us why this is important and how the current rules lead to greater inequity in our sector?
Well, let me start off with asking you how much time you have, because this has been a big part of my legislative life in the Senate for the last 3 years. So just to deconstruct it a bit, I'll give you a bit of a 101 on the Income Tax Act as it pertains to charities and how it is currently worded and why I am set on reforming it. So the Income Tax Act states that charitable dollars, publicly exempt charitable, tax-exempt charitable dollars may only be spent on a charity's own activities. So, let's say the YMCA gets charitable dollars, it spends it on its programs, that's perfectly legal. Or a charity can grant charitable dollars to another charity. So let's say the Toronto Community Foundation grants to the local YMCA. That is within the realm of the law. But it excludes anyone else from entering the charitable and philanthropic space. So this impacts organizations, groups, movements, not-for-profits, social enterprises that are not charitable, but they're doing really good public work and community work on the ground. And largely, they are mostly marginalized groups. The only way at this point a charity or a foundation can work with such a group that is not charitable, but doing good work to advance their charitable purpose is to enter into a very archaic, onerous legal agreement that basically confers the rights of the project, including the intellectual property rights, the voice of the project, back to the funding charity. This is called direction and control. Now, I just want to let those two words sink in. Direction and control. I need not tell the audience how these two words are heard by marginalized groups, especially Indigenous groups. We will give you the money, but we will direct and control you. The impact on international development charities is also extremely severe, because international development, by virtue of its nature, must engage organizations, individuals, communities that are far away. And here's a charity in Canada that is forced to engage in this direction and control behavior. And it is no surprise that local communities in the developing South think of this as a form of neocolonialism and white saviorism. Now, I will be the first to admit that the law was not written with systemic racism in its code. It was unintentional, but the unintentional impact is huge. And the reason the law was written was to provide tight accountability for the charitable dollar. And I do not argue against that accountability, which is why my act is called the Effective and Accountable Charities Act. I just think, and my law proposes, you can get the accountability, but you can get it differently, protect the public's interest in the charitable dollar, and yet also engage in empowering relationships with non-charitable groups. I should add that Canada's top charity lawyers, 37 of them, who make most of their, who build a lot of charities for this, for arranging these legal agreements, and they call these legal agreements a piece of legal fiction. They have written an open letter calling on the government to amend the law. So I'll just stop there, because as I said, I could talk about it forever, but I won't. It is rather technical in nature, but it has an outsized impact on communities that are outside the charitable space. So getting on to other questions, and we're fastly burning up the time here. So I think we need to, move on to hopefully questions from the floor. So the assets of, community foundations have also grown very rapidly. Has their impact also grown?
Well, that is true, Senator Omodvar. Our assets have grown. As I mentioned earlier, assets have grown, while at the same time, and I think this is your point, wealth disparities have increased as well. community foundations have really stepped up during the pandemic, during this time, and I'm grateful to see that we have. We're giving more, we're upping distributions, providing quicker turnaround times on funding, creating less onerous processes on granting, and in many cases, providing more flow-through funding as opposed to building that permanent capital. Clearly, the community model is responding. Now, but your question specifically is, whether I feel that the asset growth is having a proportionate relationship to impact. Well, let me draw on some data points. Imagine Canada, and I think you cited this earlier, Senator Omidvar. Imagine Canada reports that total foundation assets in the last 10 years, well, between 2008 and 2019, have tripled. They've gone from $39.5 billion to $616 billion. Now, there are organizations, the Justice Fund, being one of them, Give3, have suggested that this is a hoarding of assets. And there's a narrative out there that this is happening. I think it's more complicated than that. I can honestly say community foundations are dispersing as much as they can without encroaching on their capital. I don't believe community foundations are intentionally hoarding assets or that our business models are designed to perpetuate such behaviors. Our business models can and should evolve, though, especially if we take the position that permanent capital is important. Now, significant asset growth needs to be matched with proportionate and sufficient impact in our communities. That is something I think we can all agree on. Now, how do we do this? Number one, we have to ensure our organizations represent our community's diversity and that our actions prioritize that very community. We can't continue to put donors above community, and I think you referenced that earlier. The second is this: we have to consider how our granting is empowering equity-seeking groups by virtue of trust and goodwill, and this speaks to your bill. And the third is we have to look at, and I think there's a question about this in the chat, but people like Terry Cook and Martin Garban-Connell in Edmonton have been working on this, which is we have to ensure that the remaining 90 to 95% of our assets are having an impact in some way that goes beyond maximizing investment returns. If we can achieve this, asset growth won't be such a polarizing issue for us anymore. Instead, our asset growth will be commensurate with impact and will lead to more abundance for our communities. Now, Senator Omidvar, you mentioned time, and I know we're coming close to time, but we each have one more question, and then we can open it up. So I'm going to ask you the last question for you, and that is this. The past 2 years have caused many to confront the reality of systemic racism. What was sparked by the murder of George Floyd in 2020, the subsequent global protests on racial justice, and here in Canada, as you mentioned earlier, the remains uncovered of hundreds, maybe thousands of Indigenous children at former residential schools have led us all to collectively grapple with the difficult truths about us, our institutions, and our country. So here's the question. Do you believe we are in a pivotal moment, and what must we do to ensure that there is systemic change in front of us?
Yes, we are at a pivotal moment. As I said right at the beginning of this conversation, philanthropy is at a crossroads, and the question really is which bend in the road will philanthropy take? And I'm very, very grateful to the Toronto Community Foundation for convening this and for their courage for convening this conversation. First, I think, I'm a legislator, so I think about laws a lot more than I used to. First of all, I think our laws must change to create space for Indigenous and marginalized communities. That space does not exist. They are fenced off from it for the reasons that I described to you. So the laws must change. I think next, Canadians, regardless we're philanthropists or not, we must accept our own history. We must accept that it is ours, the good, bad, and the ugly. And there is a huge ugly underbelly to it. And we must accept that our privilege accrues to some extent from this history, whether we participated directly, indirectly, or not at all. That's not the question. It's our collective history. So I would urge everyone in this room to develop their own engagement with reconciliation. There is a roadmap that is readily available to everyone, and it is the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You can engage with any one of those, but remember what both Andrew and I have said repeatedly throughout this webinar is that you when you do so, don't do to people, but do it with people. So put the Indigenous people at the center of your journey. So let me keep it brief in that way, and ask you, Andrew. We're certainly at a moment of reckoning. Do you believe that this conversation about decolonizing wealth has some substance, or is it simply the buzzword and a bit of performance art? And I'm not suggesting that it is, but I'm asking you the question.
It's a good question. I'm going to be brief with my answer, Senator Omidvar, because we really want to open things up to the audience. And I have a few questions here from the audience, which I'll follow up with. I've also heard this called the decolonized philanthropy, and I'm definitely a student in this area. I have only begun my reconciliation journey probably back in 2015. But I think the best thing I can do is offer up two examples that I just think are remarkable. One of them, actually, it relates to two foundations, two private foundations, the In Spirit Foundation, led by Sadia Zaman, and the Laidlaw Foundation, led by Jihad Alawiwi. And both organizations transferred capital. They transferred their portion of their endowments to support the launch and creation of two organizations that Sharon mentioned earlier on, the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund and the Foundation for Black Communities. And the total investment of capital and operating support amounted to almost $4 million. This is truly, in my mind, this is decolonizing philanthropy. This is empowering others with your own capital. And I just think they're remarkable examples that are playing out in Canada. So, Senator Omidvar, that concludes our conversation. And now I am in receipt of some questions. I'm going to open up my phone here and look for the questions that have come in and from the audience. And I'm going to direct the first one to you, and I'll also respond to others if we have time. So here it is. Here's the first question. What have you learned about foundations or philanthropy during the pandemic? What strengths has it underscored and what weaknesses has it exposed?
That's an excellent question. I think that I have witnessed leadership from foundations. Foundations have opened up their checkbooks and responded generously. But I'm not sure all foundations have. So I'm not in possession of the evidence to, and again, if one were to have the evidence and look at the reports on philanthropic giving from the CRA for this last year, we might well see a trend line with a big jump in giving. But what I have witnessed is foundations asking the tough questions. Foundations asking, why am I not able to work with people on the margins? Why is the law constructed the way it is? What can I do to be more inclusive and not simply consult with or talk to stakeholders, but bring people into decision-making circles? So I have seen a trend towards self-reflection, self-criticism, and self-correction. But whether this is true for the entire philanthropic sector, I am not able to say. I think that information should be gleaned by Imagine Canada or someone else a year from now, because the data always lags the performance. But I do think that the crisis has disclosed and discovered leadership in a way that was not prevalent before. We talk comfortably about racism in this room. We talk comfortably about inequity in this room. We talk with discomfort about the history of racism and colonization of the indigenous people. And it's okay for all of us to be uncomfortable, but we have to have that conversation. And I think that those are hopeful signs.
Those are hopeful signs, Senator. There is another question, and it kind of touches on something that you and I talked about earlier on, and I think we can both answer this question, but we talked a lot about the disbursement quota and that number 3.5%. There's a question about what about the other 96.5%? And do you have any thoughts on that, on what that looks like or feels like for you?
You're referring to the asset base of foundations?
That's correct.
Well, I do think that the salutary, wonderful example you gave of the Inspirit Foundation and the Late Law Foundation it sets a very high bar. It is extremely courageous of these foundations and very relevant as their response to not just give grants or include people in their decision making, but actually to transfer their capital assets. That's kind of unheard of, Andrew. I hope you will. Yeah. So I'd like to see more foundations do that kind of divesting themselves of their own power and privilege and sharing it with others. It comes down to that, not even sharing, letting it go maybe. And so I take great hope from that example.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm glad you reemphasized that, Senator Omidyar. I will say that I think it's critically important that that foundations start to look at the broader asset base and how they can deploy that and impact. And by no means would I ever suggest that it should look the same way in every community. I think every community has to inform that discussion, but nonetheless, you just can't leave 95% of your assets, quote unquote, on the balance sheet doing nothing, particularly at this point in time. There's another, I'm going to keep going with questions until the Toronto Foundation tells me I can't go any longer, but I figure we're getting close. This next question, are there ways to unlock existing permanent endowments in order to give much more or all of those funds away at a greater rate than currently structured with a community foundation? Do you feel comfortable answering that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it from my view as a legislator. I mean, and I need everyone to put themselves in my shoes. I'm a senator. We amend laws all the time. There is a law that gets changed this way. There's another law that gets changed another way. I don't understand why bylaws that govern permanent endowments cannot also be changed. Someone has to educate me on that. But I just ask the question, a very plebeian question. If laws can be changed and laws impact everyone's lives, why can't the governing councils or the directors look at changing their bylaws in different ways? These are not, citadels of perpetuity that cannot be changed one way or another. I'm not a lawyer, but I do think that it would be useful for those who are interested in this conversation to convene a bunch of lawyers who are specialists in governance and ask them the question: is it possible to change the bylaws? I understand it's, and I don't know whether the conversation about, we can't do this because our bylaws don't allow us to, whether it's inherent resistance, it's a fig leaf, or it's reality. I don't know that, but I think it's an important question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of the things that I'm hearing, and perhaps they're generational, Senator Omidyar, but there's a younger generation of Canadians that are facing the very real possibility that they're never going to own a home in this country. And these are professional young people that make good incomes, that home ownership is not available to them. That if we don't get a handle on global warming, that in fact there is a code red for humanity, and we will experience much more extreme weather events, much in the same way that have been experienced on both coasts and in the north this year. And it changes the appetite and affinity towards perpetuity and permanency. because it creates a sense of urgency in one's life. And it's just a reminder that the world that I entered into when I was 25 years old and graduated from university and started working in a major accounting firm and had my whole life in front of me is vastly different than a 25-year-old today. And I think that has an impact on what we're putting in front of donors. And so although there's this conversation about can we change trust agreements, there's also a conversation about, is it the thing that we should be centering and positioning as we go into the future? I think there's always space for it. I think we can always have space for it. But there need to be a recalibration around that, I think is another interesting question. We have until 8:20, Senator Omidyar. Are you good to stay on the call?
Fascinating conversation.
Okay, so I'm gonna keep going because we have a lot of questions. Many foundations engaging in impact investing are investing through ESG integration and ESG screens. There is limited evidence that shifting capital to these channels drive impact. Where we see more impact is in the private markets. However, foundations tend to limit their investment. How can we support foundations to see this opportunity to drive deeper impact? I think this is about recognizing that there's more opportunity in the private investment space around ESG or having impact, and how can we encourage foundations to move into that space?
Well, the government is encouraging it, and I'm happy to have played a role in the creation of the Social Finance Fund, $750 million fund, and it was really the leadership of a private foundation, the McConnell Foundation, that got the government there, and it's premised on the understanding that there is a space there. It's not the private market, but it's an in-between space between community investors and the government, where investments can be made in the public good and returns can be created. Maybe they're not, the kinds of returns you get in the capital market, but I believe that there are enough philanthropists and business leaders and community groups who are happy, would be willing to leave a legacy, let's say, of housing or clean water or whatever it is that grabs their passion, and get a smaller return in a private market space. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question correctly, but I do believe that the social finance marketplace, when it's up and ready, it's not ready yet because it still has to build the capacity both of investors and doers, and you have to build the knowledge base and the competencies, because it's one thing to take a grant, it's another thing to accept an investment and provide a return for it against a stated good. So when it's up and ready, that is, I believe, going to be a major solution, because there isn't enough money in the world, in Canada at least, with foundations and with the government to address all the issues that we are facing today. We have to find another solution, and I'm very, very attracted and very anxious to see the Social Finance Fund start investing in the community.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you raised the Social Finance Fund. But speaking of solutions, there is a question that has specifically been asked to you and not to me. Thank God. Now, I read the question. I think it has a presupposition in it that you might want to clarify, but I'll ask it the way that it's written. Now that the Effective and Accountable Charities Act has been passed, does that mean that foundations can grant funding to nonprofit organizations without registered charitable status, and that those grants count towards the overall disbursement quota? Can you clarify?
Oh, I wish your question was completely accurate. I would love to take that question when the act is passed. The act passed the Senate. It is now in the House of Commons, and it has to go through first reading, second reading, committee amendments before it's called into royal assent. But when it is passed, and I like the premise of your question, when it is passed, yes, there will be an accountability framework, which will be spelled out in the Act, and it will be further enriched through consultations. The Act will not be called into life for 2 years. And I know that's a bitter pill for many to swallow, but it requires 2 years of consultations by the CRA to get the accountability regulations sorted out. And then when all this is done, the CRA will issue new guidelines. It will issue the guidelines to foundations that which outline very clearly how their granting to charitable organizations will function. So what's that saying? There's many a slip between the cup and the lip. So I'm very anxious about what happens in the next in the next 6 months in the House of Commons with all the upheaval that's taking place in the House of Commons. I'm holding on to my dearest fervent wish and desire that this act actually passes.
Well, thank you for clarification on that, Senator Omidyar. And yeah, I was wondering, I don't think it had passed, but that was the presupposition in the question. The next inquiry is again, kind of going back to investments. And, there's been a lot of conversation about, the T3010, the charitable information return. It's something I used to fill out every year. And became quite familiar with it. And in that charitable information return, we disclose all sorts of things. But there's a question around our investments, and should we be allowed to invest in things that perpetuate the same issues that our grantings tried to solve? I mean, this is that paradox of the business model. You go off and invest money to maximize return. You don't really take a look at who you're invested in terms of what they're doing socially, and then use the granting money to resolve those issues. But do you have any thoughts on how we can, how it is that we can evaluate our investments to minimize the risk that they don't perpetuate the issues that are in our community?
Andrew, I'm hugely distracted by the chat.
Okay,
so I'm going to answer some questions in the chat first.
Okay, go for it.
The law could be passed as early as June of this year. But once the law is passed, the law has to be further interpreted in regulations, and those regulations will take 2 years. So, wish me well. And if you are signing on to this law, I would urge you to call your local MP. Call your local MP and say, this law needs to change because of A, B, and C. So I'm sorry if I'm so distracted by the chat. And I do notice that someone has written, we have many workarounds. Yep. We don't fear. True, there are workarounds, but they oppress, as I have suggested, the non-charitable partner through a relationship that is not a relationship of empowerment. I actually describe it in the Senate that this relationship between grantor and non-charitable grantee actually amounts to is tantamount to a takeover. Oh. So yes, there are workarounds. When I worked at a private foundation, I had these workarounds too, because we wanted to give to community. Getting back to your question, which I have frankly forgotten, what is it? Could you quickly restate that for me?
I can absolutely restate it. And I closed the chat. I wasn't even looking at the chat.
Yeah,
so it wasn't a distraction.
Should not have done that.
It's about our investments and how do we monitor and evaluate our investments to ensure that they're not perpetuating the challenges that our granting work is trying to resolve.
Well, I'm not an investment specialist, but I think many foundations have developed screens, and that's a good first step, but it's not the last step. Screens are only as good as the mesh that they are built around. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in the investment world about ethical funds and non-ethical funds and sustainable funds and pure funds, et cetera, et cetera. I think if foundations and philanthropists are really keen on investing in a way that promotes their charitable purpose as opposed to detracting from it, then they must get into the soil, so to say, of investment, and seek out investments that mirror their mission, and possibly invest through their endowment in such efforts. Possibly their return might be a little lower, but that will create a huge impact. I can just imagine a foundation interested in building affordable housing actually took its assets and put it into affordable housing. You know, I mean, it's to me clear as what, Andrew? Clear as
Clear as
water.
day.
Clear as
Clear as
day.
water.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm losing my.
Well, Senator Omidvar, I think, you know, we're at the end of our time. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, to spar back and forth with you, the energy, and, you know, we're doing a lot of work to find a home in government, and that's work that Imagine Canada is doing. And in some ways, I feel like you are our home in government. You are a champion for so much of what we do, and you understand the sector. It's so hard to find people on the Hill that understand the sector, and you do, and we appreciate you being a champion for us. And please let us know how we can support your work and your leadership in this area. Sharon, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And both the Senator and I, we so value this time you created for us and this conversation. Thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. First of all, the chat has never been this lively. It's lively at Toronto Foundation gatherings, but not this lively. And I love that the Senator got distracted with questions about, you know, something she's thrown herself into. And both of you, the passion, the commitment, how prepared you were for this conversation. It's a complex conversation, but it's so essential. And I can't thank you both enough for what you have done tonight, but what you do for the sector and how important your voices are in this conversation. And this quite honestly, a senator coming from a white capped organization. And that is, I mean, we just have to call it what it is. And we need to change. We need to transform, not optimize. These are things I heard. We need to come at this with humility. And we need to get involved in not just the work we're doing with the community, but also I think we heard a lot of messages today from you, Senator, about the value of partnering with government and having your voice heard. And so I add to the someone in chat was saying, let's talk to our MPs. Let's get this bill passed. And I agree, let's get on with this because it's long enough to wait after it gets passed to put it in action. And we want, this needs to happen. So thank you both so very much for bringing these issues to the fore. And I can't believe how quickly this time has gone by, but we're so grateful for you both.